Grief is strange, not just painful, strange, because one day your world looks normal from the outside, but internally, nothing feels the same anymore. And the hardest part? Most people expect grief to look obvious. Crying, breaking down, talking about the loss constantly. But real grief often looks quieter than that. Sometimes it looks like exhaustion, like emotional numbness, like forgetting who you used to be. And nobody really warns you about that part. They tell you grief hurts, but they rarely tell you that grief changes your entire relationship with life itself. Let's slow this down. When people think about grief, they usually think about death. But grief is bigger than that. People grieve lost parents, lost futures, lost health, lost versions of themselves. Grief appears anytime something meaningful disappears permanently. And the human mind struggles deeply with permanent change. Because grief is not just missing something, it's realizing something is never coming back. That realization changes people. At first, the mind resists it. You expect the person to text. You expect their voice. You expect life to suddenly feel normal again. Even when you know the truth logically, part of your brain still refuses to accept it emotionally. That's why grief feels surreal. Reality becomes divided. One part of you knows what happened. Another part still cannot believe it. And while the world continues moving, part of you feels frozen in time. That's something many grieving people experience silently. Everyone else keeps living normally. But internally, you feel disconnected from the entire world. Simple things become difficult. Music sounds different. Places feel different. Even laughter can feel strange. Not because you no longer feel emotions, but because grief changes the emotional weight of everything around you. Now here's the part almost nobody talks about honestly. Grief is not linear. People love saying, it gets better with time, but grief doesn't move in straight lines. Sometimes you feel okay for weeks. Then suddenly, a smell, a song, a random memory, and the pain returns instantly. Not smaller, not weaker, just as real as before. That can make grieving people feel broken. They think, why am I still affected by this? Why does it still hurt this much? But grief is not a problem to solve. It's an emotional wound learning how to exist inside a new reality. Let that sink in. Because healing from grief does not mean forgetting. It means learning how to carry the loss without it destroying you every day. And that takes far longer than most people understand. Now here's another difficult truth. Grief changes identity, especially after deep loss. Because certain people, routines, and connections become part of how we understand ourselves. When they disappear, part of your identity disappears too. That's why grieving people often say, I don't feel like myself anymore. And they're right. A version of them no longer exists. The person they were before the loss cannot fully return. That realization can feel terrifying, because grief forces people to rebuild themselves emotionally. And rebuilding takes energy that grieving people often don't have. That's why grief can create isolation. Not because people want to be alone, but because explaining the pain feels impossible. How do you explain a loss that changed the way your entire inner world feels? Most people can't. So they say, I'm okay, even when they're not. Now here's something important. Grief does not always look sad. Sometimes it looks like anger, irritation, distraction, emotional shutdown, because pain searches for somewhere to go. And when emotions become overwhelming, the mind sometimes numbs itself to survive. That numbness scares many grieving people. They think, why can't I feel anything? But numbness is not the absence of grief. Sometimes it is grief, the nervous system protecting itself from emotional overload. Now let's pause. Think about this carefully. Most grieving people are not asking others to fix the pain. What they want is for the loss to be acknowledged, to feel understood, seen, remembered. Because one of the loneliest parts of grief is watching the world move on while you still carry the absence every day. That silence can feel unbearable, especially when everyone assumes you should be better by now. But grief has no clean timeline. Some losses stay with people forever, not because they failed to heal, but because love leaves permanent marks. And maybe that's what grief truly is. Love with nowhere to go. Love that still exists after the person, future, or moment is gone. That's why grief hurts so deeply. Because the connection mattered deeply. Now here's the shift. Healing does not mean returning to who you were before. Sometimes healing means becoming someone new while carrying the memory forward. And slowly, life begins growing around the pain, not replacing it, not erasing it, but making space for both grief and living at the same time. That is what many people misunderstand. The goal is not to stop missing. The goal is learning that you can still live while carrying what you lost. And that takes extraordinary strength. If this video resonated with you, remember this: grief changes people deeply. Not because they are weak, but because love, loss, and memory leave permanent fingerprints on the human mind.